Remus slept fitfully. Awful, confused images plagued his dreams, and more than once he woke with a start, imagining he could hear crying or furious bellowing. James and Lily hovered in his subconscious, never speaking. The only dream he could clearly remember was one of Lily sobbing beside her son's bed, and it effectively kept him from drifting off at all afterwards. When grey dawn light finally began to creep through the curtains, Remus gave up and rolled out of bed. He crept down the hall to check on Harry before showering and dressing haphazardly. Then he went downstairs, trying to decide what to do next. What he very much wanted to do was storm into Dumbledore's office and rage at the man for telling him not to worry about this, for putting Harry in that house in the first place, for trying to put him back. But that would have to wait. First Harry had to be tended to. There were 2 options for healing. Well, 3, but Remus's potion skills were minimal at best, and this was far beyond ordinary first aid, which meant he needed help. There wasn't any way Remus was calling an ordinary Mediwitch, like the one he had had as a child, at least before he was bitten. Some stranger was not coming near Harry right now, not with everything that was going on and with Harry being famous and all of that. So this left 2 people, Madame Pomfrey or Molly Weasley. Madame Pomfrey was certainly better trained to handle something like this, Remus reasoned. He trusted her, of course, after all the monthly stays he'd had in the hospital wing at school. But there was something about Molly Weasley that was comforting. She was far more used to dealing with small children and would most likely be better at assuaging Harry's fear. She would also be more likely to be up at this hour, not to mention Remus would not have to go through Dumbledore for her. Remus bent over the fire and tossed a handful of Floo powder into it, saying the burrow as he thrust his head into the flames. A moment of dizzying spinning later, he was looking out into a cramped kitchen cluttered with all the signs of being part schoolroom and part playroom to 5 small children. And, to Remus's relief, a plump, red-haired woman sat at the scrubbed wooden table, sipping a mug of steaming tea. "Molly." Mrs. Weasley started at Remus's hoarse voice, nearly spilling her tea. "Remus. Gracious, you startled me. Is something the matter?" she asked worriedly, taking in his sleep-deprived appearance and the early hour. "Yes," Remus said heavily. "I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I need your help." "Is Harry all right?" Mrs. Weasley asked more anxiously still as she set her cup aside and knelt in front of the fire. Mrs. Weasley grew steadily paler as she listened to Remus's pained explanation of the situation. By the time he'd finished, tears were sparkling in her eyes. "Oh, the poor child," she whispered, hands at her mouth. "Of course I'll come, Remus. Just let me tell Arthur what's going on so he can stay with the children." "You needn't rush," Remus told her. "Harry isn't even awake yet and he doesn't know anything about magic yet. I'll need to explain how he broke that glass last night before you come over. Can you come in an hour or so?" "Certainly," Mrs. Weasley agreed at once. "Oh, Remus. I can't imagine how anyone could do such awful things to a little boy." "Me either," Remus mumbled. "Thank you very much, Molly." And with that he withdrew from the fire. Remus knelt on the hearthrug for a moment, waiting for his head to stop spinning. Then he headed for the kitchen. Glass still sparkled everywhere across the floor. He had taken out his wand and was on the point of repairing everything when an idea struck him and he put his wand back in his pocket. He'd leave the mess for now. A muffled sneeze made him turn around. Harry stood at the bottom of the stairs, pinching his nose as his breath began to catch again. Helios mute on the banister beside him. "Hecho." Harry sneezed again, rubbing his nose and eyes with his knuckles. "Bless you," Remus said warmly, grabbing a tissue from a side table as he crossed over to Harry. Harry took the tissue gratefully as he rocked forward with a third sneeze. He gave Helios a cautious look, unsure of what to think of the animal after last night, and edged away from him. Remus noticed and a suspicion began to form. "Harry. Are you allergic to cats?" he asked. Harry looked up at him sharply and then shook his head. "Are you sure?" Remus persisted, scooping Helios off the banister to loud yells of protest from the creature. I'm not." Harry tried to protest, but his breath was catching as Remus knelt down in front of him, Helios in his arms. "Cuckoo." Remus raised an eyebrow. He stood up and backed away, taking Helios with him. Harry sniffled, but didn't sneeze. Remus dropped the cat lightly on the floor and Helios padded back over to Harry, wrapping himself around Harry's legs. Immediately Harry scrunched up his face, trying not to give in to the tickle. Remus slowly came back to kneel before him and offered another tissue. Hey, hey. I don't need it, Harry tried to insist, turning his head away. But a moment later his head jerked forward in a silent sneeze. Remus watched uneasily as the boy's entire torso bucked forward in 2 more silent sneezes. That couldn't be good for him. I think you do, Remus countered, waving the tissue towards him. You shouldn't sneeze like that, he went on. It looks painful and it can't be good for you. Chew. Harry sneezed, flinging up an arm to catch the sneeze. Come on, Helios, Remus said, scooping the cat up again as Helios leapt up on Harry's legs and Harry doubled over with another sneeze. Leave the poor boy alone. He carried Helios to the back door and dropped him outside. Go on, go hunt for a bit and we'll figure out what to do about you later. Chew. I coo. Coo. Harry sneezed, covering his face with his hands. Here, Remus said gently, wiping off Harry's face and hands with a clean handkerchief. Why didn't you tell me it was that old cat making you sick? Harry didn't respond. He only looked down at his knees, feeling small and stupid and worried. He didn't think Remus would kick him out because of the cat now, not after last night, but it didn't seem like he could do anything right. Remus felt his heart break a little more at the utterly miserable expression on the boy's face. No matter, he said soothingly. But I'd like to know things like this from now on, all right? It's my job to make sure you're all right. Harry nodded, sneezing one last time into his shoulder. Bless you, Remus said, offering another tissue. Now, I've got something to show you, he went on, standing up and leading Harry towards the kitchen. They stopped at the edge of the tile and Harry peered across the glass-strewn floor with a mixture of guilt and trepidation. Was he getting in trouble for the glass after all? Perhaps Remus had forgotten about it last night because he felt sorry for Harry, but now he'd be in for it. Do you know how that happened? Remus asked. Honestly, he added, remembering Harry's panicked denial last night. It's all right, you won't get into trouble. Harry chewed his lip for a moment before answering timidly, why yes. I broke it. But I don't know how, he hastened to add, leaning away from Remus to cower against the side of the cabinets. Well, it's a good thing I do then, Remus said lightly, smiling at Harry's bewildered expression. And I can fix it, too. With that, Remus pulled his wand out of his pocket and waved it at the shattered pieces, saying Reparo totalum. Harry gaped as the glass shards flew back together into seamless panes of glass and reaffixed themselves into the cabinet doors, looking as if they'd never been broken. He turned his wide eyes on Remus, opening and closing his mouth, but unable to make even one of his millions of questions into sound. It's magic, Remus said simply. What you and I and a lot of other people can do is magic. When you're young, you don't have much control over it, and when you get upset or scared, you might accidentally make something happen. But when you get old enough to go to school and get a wand, you learn how to use it properly. Harry's eyes were practically popping out of his head as Remus bent to look at him on a level. You told me funny things happen around you, he said quietly. Were you angry or frightened when they happened? Harry thought back to the few times strange things had happened. It was almost always when he was angry or frightened. He nodded slowly. It's because you're a wizard, Harry. Just like me. Just like your dad. And your mum was a witch. Just like loads of other people. Your aunt and uncle, they are what we call muggles, though. It's what witches and wizards call people who can't do magic. Neither muggles nor witches and wizards are better, and being one or the other doesn't make you a freak. It just makes us different. But I don't think your aunt and uncle could understand that. You aren't a freak, Harry. You aren't at all. Remus looked at the little boy earnestly, hoping very much that he was going about this the right way. Harry didn't move for a few moments, staring open-mouthed at Remus. But finally he found his voice. I'm magic. Yes. The things you can do are magic. And when you turn 11 you'll get a wand of your own and go off to school to learn how to use it properly, Remus told him. Like in the films and the fairy tale books. Harry pressed. Remus hesitated, not very familiar with Muggle fairy tales. Something like that, I'd imagine. And, There are lots of people who can do magic, too. A whole world. But of course, we have to stay hidden from the Muggles. It's against the law to let Muggles know about magic. But you needn't worry about that just yet. Harry turned his head to gaze at the newly mended cabinets, still looking utterly shocked. You know, we never did get around to that hot chocolate last night, did we? Remus said. What do you say we make some now? And he lifted Harry onto the counter so that he could have a good view as Remus directed the kettle and cocoa and mugs to put themselves in order. Harry looked uncertainly between Remus and the woman sitting beside him on the bed. Remus said the woman was called Mrs. Weasley and that she was his friend and had come over to take care of Harry's injuries. He'd also said she was a witch and was going to use magic to heal him. The woman seemed nice enough. She had a kind smile and gentle eyes, but Harry wasn't sure he wanted to show her what Uncle Vernon had done to him. For all that Remus had said about Harry not being a freak, he couldn't quite believe that everyone would see it that way. Remus had known Harry before he saw all of that. He didn't think Harry was a horrible little boy. But Mrs. Weasley didn't know him at all. She would probably think he deserved it. And then of course there was still the fact that he was not supposed to tell people. Remus was one thing, but to show a complete stranger. Come on, dear Mrs. Weasley coaxed gently. I'm going to fix you right up. Harry bit his lip, wondering if magic hurt. Mrs. Weasley tsked as she ran a hand through Harry's messy hair, making the little boy tense at the touch. Remus, when was the last time the child had a bath? Remus looked guilty. I was going to give him one last night after we'd been outside, but... Never mind, we'll get him cleaned up, she soothed. My boys like me to add bubbles to their baths and turn them colors, Mrs. Weasley said to Harry. Do you think you'd like that? Harry stayed silent as ever, though he was thinking bubbles did look really cool to play with. I've an idea, Mrs. Weasley smiled. Why don't I run you a nice warm bubble bath right now? How does that sound? Harry didn't answer. That's a good idea, Remus said for him, and Mrs. Weasley headed down the hall to start the water. Harry, she's going to make you feel better, Remus tried to persuade him. But you've got to let her see everything. She's the kindest woman you'll ever meet, he asserted. You needn't be afraid. Harry squirmed. He wasn't afraid of Mrs. Weasley. In fact, she was the first adult he could remember not being afraid of at all. But he still didn't like the idea of her seeing all his bruises and marks. Come on, Remus said, scooping Harry off the bed and carrying him down to the bathroom, where Mrs. Weasley sat on the edge of the tub, a fluffy towel waiting neatly beside her. She smiled at Harry when Remus set him down in front of her. Do you need anything from me, Molly? Remus asked. Only I need to speak to Dumbledore, but I don't want to leave Harry alone. We'll be fine, Mrs. Weasley told him. Go and speak to him, Remus. We've got things in here, haven't we, dear? Harry shifted, leaning against Remus's leg. He didn't want Remus to leave. He was feeling all unsettled again. Like he had when Mrs. Fig left. Remus wasn't going to leave him like the Dursleys had, was he? They had said they were coming back, too. I won't be gone long, Remus assured both Mrs. Weasley and Harry. He knelt down to look into Harry's face. When I see you again, you'll be all clean and healed, right? Harry knew there wasn't anything to do but nod, so that was what he did. Good. Remus smiled at him again and straightened up, thanking Mrs. Weasley one more time before slipping out of the bathroom and closing the door behind him. Well, the water's all ready, Mrs. Weasley told Harry cheerfully, turning off the spout. Let's get you out of those pajamas, home. She knelt down in front of Harry, talking like Remus did to distract Harry as she slowly unbuttoned his shirt. I've got a little boy your age, you know, she told Harry with the first button. He quite likes lions, too. I noticed you've got a picture of one in your room. The second button. And my husband would love your airplanes. The third button. Maybe you can show me how they work later. The fourth button. Harry's pajama shirt fell open and Mrs. Weasley slid it off. Even though Remus had warned her, she couldn't help but gasp when she saw for herself the dark bruises covering the little boy's thin frame in large, dark splotches, the harsh red welts smarting on his chest and curling around his arms, and the feathery pattern of white scars, the remnants of old injuries. The little boy standing before her had been battered and beaten so terribly. She felt like bursting into tears right there, gathering the boy up in her arms like she did her own children and never letting him go. But, of course, she couldn't. "Come here, dear," she murmured, guiding Harry over to the closed toilet and sitting him down on the lid. Slowly, she withdrew her wand. "I'm just going to heal some of those bruises before we get you into the tub, all right?" She examined his torso, picking the worst-looking patches, and slowly waved her wand over them, murmuring an incantation. The worst of the bruising faded very slightly, the splotches receding a little bit. She passed her wand over them again and the dark bruises faded even more. Very slowly, Mrs. Weasley worked her way up and down both arms, across Harry's chest and stomach and then onto his back, which was the worst. As she worked, she chatted cheerily about anything she could think of, knowing it was best to keep the boy's mind off of what she was doing. She tried to ask Harry questions, but he didn't give much in response. After Mrs. Weasley had finished with his torso, she slipped off his pajama bottoms and continued the healing spell down his bruised and scarred legs. There was a shiny burn mark on Harry's left shin and a pattern of angry red scars on the top of his foot that made her heart clench as she imagined what had caused them. Finally, when she'd done all she felt safe doing on such a small, thin child, Mrs. Weasley sat back and smiled at him. "Well, that's done now," she said. "Usually we can just wave our wands and heal a bruise right up, but since there were so many, I've just sped them along a bit. They ought to be gone in a day or two, but you'll probably be very sleepy while they heal. I've got a cream for those welts, but I'll put that on after you're all cleaned up." Harry was shivering by now and already beginning to feel drowsy. He watched dazedly as Mrs. Weasley tapped the side of the tub to warm the water back up and then trailed the tip of her wand over the surface, leaving mounds of foamy bubbles on the water. A flick of her wand and they were slowly turning from icy white, to light blue and then to a pastel green and on. Harry couldn't help but perk up a little, eyes widening when he saw that. Mrs. Weasley chuckled a bit. "My daughter always likes that," she told Harry, helping him over to the tub and into the water. It was wonderfully warm. Harry could never remember being enveloped in something so warm and soothing before. His baths at the Dursleys were quick, harsh scrubs from his aunt, usually after he was sprayed down with cold water. But this was wonderful. The water smelled like lavender and the foam tickled his chest and stuck to his chin like a beard. The bubbles floated up and landed on his nose and he sneezed, making a ripple in the sea of foam. He giggled. Mrs. Weasley smiled as she watched the little boy gather handfuls of color-changing suds and run his hands through the mountains and clouds of foam around him, looking delighted when they swirled in the water. The boy hadn't said one word to her, but this, watching him be so happy, it was better than 1,000 words. She took a cloth, poured a potion that would help with the stinging onto it, and began to wash Harry as gently as she could around the injuries. Every inch of skin was blackened or red or crisscrossed with scars. She kept up a steady stream of chatter as she gently scrubbed, but she couldn't stop the tears from leaking out of her eye and falling, unnoticed, into the bath water. Harry was getting drowsy quickly though. He leaned against Mrs. Weasley's arm as she held him upright, sponging the last of the soap out of his hair. Mrs. Weasley could tell he was nearly asleep and half lifted him to his feet, keeping one hand firmly on his shoulder as she groped for the fresh towel and wrapped it around his shoulders before lifting him out of the tub. He was so small that the towel fell past his knees, even when she pulled it over his head to dry his hair. "There you are," she said brightly, pulling the towel back like a hood so she could see his face again and the black hair that stuck up wildly like downy feathers on top of his head. Harry's eyelids were drooping almost closed and he tottered on his feet. "Let's get you back to bed before you fall over right here." She lifted him, wet towel and all, into her arms, well used to getting soaked during bath time after 7 of her own children, and pushed open the door. She felt Harry shiver as they left the steamy bathroom for the chillier air in the rest of the house, and wrapped the towel tighter around Harry, rubbing his back gently. He was nearly asleep on her shoulder by the time they reached his bedroom a few steps down the hallway. Remus was back, just as he'd promised, and was waiting in Harry's room. The moment they pushed open the door, he hurried over to them, looking anxiously at Harry slumped in Mrs. Weasley's arms. "He's sleepy from the spells I had to use," she explained as Remus took him from her so that she could dry her clothes with a flick of her wand. "Have you got clean pajamas to change him into?" Yes, of course, Remus mumbled, laying Harry gently on the bed and hurrying around to the dresser to pull them out. Harry, dear. Mrs. Weasley said softly, gently shaking Harry awake. We're going to put that cream I told you about on you now, all right? I'm very sorry, but it's going to sting a bit. Do you want something to hold on to? Remus snatched a stuffed tiger off a shelf and set it against Harry's arm. Harry lifted his arm to draw the tiger under the towel still draped over him and hugged it tightly to his chest, one thought in his foggy mind, preparing for pain. Mrs. Weasley pulled out a small bottle and smeared some thick, pink cream onto a fresh cloth. Then she pulled back the towel enough to expose Harry's legs, and began to gently daub at the lash marks. Mrs. Weasley expected some kind of reaction. Remus seemed to have, too, since he'd placed a comforting hand on Harry's back. But Harry didn't so much as flinch. Not a sound escaped his lips as Mrs. Weasley covered his legs and then his back and arms with the pink cream. Remus flung the wet towel out into the hallway and dressed Harry in the clean pajama bottoms, then sat him upright so Mrs. Weasley could get at his chest. He let Harry lean against him, wrapping his arms gently around Harry's middle and murmuring soothingly to him, but Harry didn't even whimper. The adults exchanged anxious looks as Mrs. Weasley buttoned the clean pajama shirt and Remus slid Harry between the sheets, tucking the blankets around the already sleeping child. Tears were once more sliding down Mrs. Weasley's cheeks. She knew how much that cream stung and smarted. When she'd used it on the twins last summer after they'd gotten blisters from the rope swing in the back garden, they'd positively howled. And they were 8 and it was just their hands. So in habit with her own children, and with her heart breaking over him, Mrs. Weasley bent to drop a kiss on Harry's slightly sweaty brow before motioning to Remus to follow her out of the room. Remus stood reluctantly, gazing miserably at Harry's small, sleeping figure. Is he going to be all right? He asked quietly once he'd shut the bedroom door behind him and the pair of them stood out on the landing. Physically. I don't think there'll be any lasting, serious debility, Mrs. Weasley answered, choosing her words carefully. There's nothing I can do about the scars though. They've already healed like that. Even some of the worst lash marks will probably leave new scars. I can't heal anything too quickly, there's too much damage, his body couldn't handle it, she explained grimly. I've just sped up the process considerably. He ought to be fine in a day or two, but he'll probably sleep most of that. It takes a lot out of a body that size to mend so much so quickly. And it doesn't help that he's malnourished. It's not your fault, Remus, Mrs. Weasley interrupted before he could even open his mouth. You've only had him for a few days. Malnourishment takes much longer than that to set in so strongly, and it will take much longer than a few days to fix. But you'll need to keep a close eye on his diet. Be sure he's getting everything he needs and start him off small. It doesn't look as if he was used to regular meals before he came here. You saw his ribs, didn't you? I'd guess he hasn't shown much of an appetite since you got him. Remus shook his head, wondering how this had never leapt out at him before. He'd known Harry was too skinny and didn't eat much, but never had he guessed as to why. Check on him every hour or so and wake him up to drink some water now and then and make sure he eats something later. Just soup is probably all he needs, but see to it that he eats. He'll probably run a fever, too, until the healing begins to wind down. He already felt a bit warm. Keep an eye on that. If it gets any higher than 100 degrees or if he starts throwing up, send for me. Or if you can't wake him up or anything else off happens. I don't think he'll have any sort of reaction to that cream or the spells, but you never know. Remus nodded, wondering if he shouldn't be writing down what she was saying. Mrs. Weasley heaved a great sigh and looked back at Harry's bedroom door. We'll be okay, though. I'm not sure, Remus. I don't know how anyone can live like that for 5 years and be okay. Me neither, Remus mumbled, the sorrow and guilt from last night washing over him once more, mixed with the fury from his report to Dumbledore just half an hour before. I'll come by tomorrow, Mrs. Weasley told him, running a hand over her face and looking exhausted, despite the early hour in the day. We may need to bandage some of those worse marks. Thank you so much for this, Molly, Remus told her once again as they started down the stairs to the fire. I know it's not what you signed up for when you and Arthur offered to help. It's quite all right, dear, she assured him. We're glad to help. She gave him a watery smile before dipping her hand into the tin of Floo powder and vanishing into the emerald flames. Rummers sagged onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. He did not know how long he'd sat like that before muffled whimpers and cries from upstairs had him bolting up the stairs. Harry twisted in his blankets, clawing at the tentacle-like grip they had around him. He was too hot. His skin felt like it was burning. The dark room, Mrs. Weasley had drawn the curtains, disoriented his foggy brain and he felt rather ill. Confused images swam in front of his eyes, carrying over form-fevered dreams. Flashes of green light and someone calling his name in a dark forest, other things he couldn't recognize or remember, but which left his heart pounding. And then suddenly there was nothing underneath him and he was falling, smacking into the ground with a thud, still tangled in blankets. Harry! Harry! Someone was beside him, trying to pick him up, and Harry thought he could hear the thundering footfalls of his uncle or that high cackling voice that haunted his nightmares, and he struggled all the harder. One of his knees came up and smacked him in the mouth, his flailing hand scraped against the underside of his bed. A shadowy figure loomed over him. Harry! Calm down, it's all right. The voice was soothing and familiar and something in it made him stop fighting. Harry lay limply on the hard wooden floor, tangled in sheets and panting hard. It's all right, the voice was saying, and suddenly Harry realized that it was Remus who knelt beside him. Cautiously, Remus scooped Harry up and lifted him back onto the bed. Harry whimpered softly as the movement rubbed his pajamas over the welts Mrs. Weasley had smeared that stingy paste over. He wished she hadn't. They hurt 10 times worse with that on them. He felt Remus push his bangs back and lay a cold hand on his forehead. Harry shivered hard at the cold touch and Remus pulled the blankets back onto the bed and tucked them around Harry again. Then he sat down on the edge of the mattress. How do you feel? Remus asked. Harry considered the question. Right now how he felt was too hot and too cold and too achy and too tired to explain it all, so he stayed quiet, gazing blearily up at Remus in the dim light from the hallway. Are you thirsty? Remus raised his wand and a few seconds later a cup soared through the open door and into his hand, but Harry was too disoriented to marvel at the magic. Another flick and the cup was full of water. Remus helped Harry sit up and held the cup to his lips. The water was delicious and Harry lapped at it eagerly, until he inhaled some of it right into his lungs and started coughing. Remus set the cup down, and grabbed a tissue to wipe away the water that had spilled down Harry's chin and chest. Let's try again, Remus coaxed as he helped Harry slide back down in bed. How do you feel? Hot, cold, hungry, sick? Harry shrugged. All of it really. He just wanted to go back to sleep. Sleep made it all go away, that was one thing Harry knew better than anything. Sleep made it all go away. Tired, he mumbled. You probably will be very tired for a while, Remus nodded. But I've got to keep waking you up so you can eat and drink and so I can take your temperature. Harry barely heard him. His eyes were already drifting shut, confused visions swirling in his mind. He rolled over and pulled the sheets up over his head, and Remus got up off the bed. But something was off. Harry couldn't tell what it was, but it made him uneasy. He rolled back over, breathing hard as the welts all over his body seared. Then he realized what it was and struggled against the sheets to sit up. Helios wasn't on his bed like always was, yowling and making Harry sneeze 500 times before he could fall asleep. What's the matter? Remus asked worriedly, turning quickly back to the bed. Helios, Harry panted, where is he? He wasn't sure why, but suddenly it seemed very important. He was worried. Remus pushed Harry gently back down and left his hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. Helios is fine, he assured him soothingly. But what's going to happen to him? Harry insisted breathlessly. I thought Mrs. Fig might like to take him, Remus explained. Oh, Harry choked. He could not explain the tears that were suddenly slipping down his cheeks. He wasn't going to miss Helios and Helios wasn't going to miss him, and he was extremely relieved that it was the cat that was going and not him, but still the tears streamed. Hey, it's okay, Remus soothed, sitting back down on the bed and pulling Harry into his arms. Helios will like going to Mrs. Fig's, and we can even go visit once in a while if you miss him so much. Harry shook his head, sniffling as more tears cascaded down his cheeks. I'm so why, he hiccuped. Whatever for? Rummus asked, looking down at him in bewilderment. Why you have to give your sea cat away because of me, Harry sobbed, his little body shaking violently in Rummus's arms. Oh Harry, said Rummus, smiling sadly and tightening his grip on the little boy. It's okay. Sure. It's okay. It's not your fault. But it is, Harry sniffled miserably, running the back of his hand under his streaming nose. It's because of Emmy that he's got to go away. Is it your fault that he makes you sick? Rummus asked, tipping Harry's face up to look into his swimming eyes. Is it? And no, I guess not, Harry mumbled. Exactly. Having him in this house makes you ill, and your health comes first, understand? Rummus said firmly, but gently. He'll be fine with Mrs. Fig. Don't you worry about that. You just worry about feeling better, all right? All right, Harry repeated obediently. Rummus plucked a tissue from the box beside Harry's bed and wiped the tears off his face with it, then handed Harry another one for his nose, which didn't seem to want to stop running. There now. Think you can get some sleep? He asked, helping Harry slide back under the covers. Harry's eyes were closed before the words were out of Rummus's mouth. XXXXX. Rummus woke Harry up around noon to make him eat some soup. It was challenge. Harry didn't want to eat anything, was so exhausted that Rummus had to hold him upright and spoon the soup into his mouth like he'd had to do when Harry was a baby. The rest of the day Rummus spent cleaning as quietly as he could. He was amazed at how much cat hair there was everywhere and was surprised Harry had been able to breathe at all with it all floating around. Helios was not thrilled about being stuck outside and spent a great deal of time yowling at the back door until Rummus, afraid he'd keep Harry awake, put a silencing charm on him. Helios shot a furious glare up at Rummus and disappeared into the brush after that. Around 5 in the evening, Rummus was pulled from his work by a small, hoarse voice calling his name from upstairs. Leaving the couch cushions he'd been cleaning scattered on the floor, Rummus hurried up to Harry's bedroom. What's up? He asked, pushing the door wide. I feel yucky, Harry mumbled, moaning softly as Rummus sat down on the edge of his mattress and his stomach swooped with the movement. Rummus was instantly anxious. He lay a hand on Harry's sweaty forehead, frowning at how hot it was. What kind of yucky? Rummus asked with concern. My tummy. Harry groaned, breathing in quick little gasps. The room spun dizzyingly. Rummus reached over and turned the lamp on to get a better look at him and Harry whimpered at the bright light. A moment later he rolled to the edge of the mattress and retched. I'm sorry, Harry choked, trying to sit up and casting scared looks at Rummus. It's all right, he murmured, rubbing soothing circles into Harry's back. Rummus vanished the sick with a flick of his wand and helped Harry sit up against the pillows. Then he handed him the cup of water from the bedside table and instructed him just to rinse his mouth and not to swallow, summoning a basin for Harry to spit into. He raised his wand to Harry's temple and muttered Therma Revlio. Harry flinched away from the luminescent red numbers that hovered an inch above his brow, blinking at them dazedly as they dispersed into nothing. 101.7, Rummus muttered, worriedly feeling Harry's forehead again. I think we better get Molly. XXXXX. Mrs. Weasley bent over Harry, a hand on his forehead and crease between her eyes. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Harry had drifted in and out of sleep, staying coherent just long enough to take a few swallows of water only to be sick a half-hour later. His fever wavered, going down a few points of a degree only to creep back up again. He couldn't hold down any of the potions Mrs. Weasley gave him for very long. He had finally slipped back into sleep for the moment, and Mrs. Weasley straightened up. Rummus stepped forward from where he'd been hovering against the wall, looking very worried. Is he? Mrs. Weasley put a finger to her lips and ushered him out of the dimly lit bedroom, leaving the door cracked so they could hear Harry's heavy breathing. What's wrong with him? Rummus asked in a hush. I've told you, Mrs. Weasley said patiently. It's just side effects from the healing I had to do. There might have been deeper damage than I thought and it's just hard on his body, that's all. But you said he shouldn't have gotten sick like that, Rummus objected, pushing the door a little wider so he could see Harry's pale, drawn face against the pillow. Well, things were a bit worse than I expected, but as long as we keep a close eye on him, he'll be fine, Mrs. Weasley said calmly. He can't even keep water down, Rummus pressed. He'd been growing more and more anxious by the hour, more than a little freaked out by his first real glimpse of an ill child. It was scary. Yes, Remus Lupin, werewolf and veteran of the last war, admitted that seeing Harry so sick so suddenly was one of the scariest things he'd ever faced. It was just that the little boy was so, well, little. And Remus was the one responsible for him, and he couldn't do anything to make him better. Children take fevers hard, but they get over it quickly, Mrs. Weasley told him. So long as you keep a close eye on it. Ron got the flu just before Halloween and he couldn't hold anything down for 3 days, but then the fever broke and he was fine by the next morning. Give it a little time. If he's still this sick this time tomorrow or if he gets much worse, we'll send for a Mediwitch. All right, Remus agreed, taking a calming breath. I suppose you ought to be heading home, he added, glancing at the hall clock with regret and more than a little fear. Yes, I ought to, Mrs. Weasley agreed. Ginny's a handful to put to bed when I'm not around to tuck her in, and Ronnie was in tears from the twins when I got home this morning. You'll be fine, Remus, she added comfortingly, patting him on the shoulder. Just do what we've been doing all evening. Stay with him until the fever breaks. Either sleep in his room or bring him into yours. Right, Remus mumbled. He'll be all right. They're tougher than you think, Mrs. Weasley said bracingly. And if you need anything, send for me. Don't worry about the time. XXXXX. The night passed in a haze. Remus didn't sleep at all. He sat beside Harry's bed, checking his temperature and whipping his face with a cool cloth. Harry woke up every hour or so, sometimes mumbling or whimpering from fevered dreams. Remus spooned water into his mouth like Mrs. Weasley had instructed, and sometimes he held it down, sometimes he didn't. Sometime around 3 in the morning Harry woke up crying. The healing welts were hurting him so much from all the tossing and turning. Remus pulled up his pajama sleeves and found a few of the worse ones looking bloody. He found some gauze in the bathroom and bandaged them as best he could, using the paste Mrs. Weasley had left. It wasn't until the sky had begun to lighten that Harry fell into a heavy sleep and Remus was able to doze. XXXXX. Remus. The hoarse whisper jerked him awake in a second. Bright morning light blazed through the curtains, making them glow brightly. Harry's eyes were open, and he was looking at him intently from where he lay on the bed. Harry, Remus croaked, sliding off the chair he'd pulled over to kneel at the edge of the mattress. How do you feel? Any better? Harry shrugged, tentatively pushing himself up on his elbows. Remus raised the basin beside him questioningly and Harry shook his head, swallowing. Not sick, he muttered. Just funny. Well, that's an improvement over yucky, Remus said lightly, pushing back Harry's damp bangs to feel his brow. Your fever's gone down, he said, amazed by how casual his voice sounded when waves of relief were washing over him. Think you can handle a little water? Harry nodded and lapped thirstily at the water in the cup Remus held to his lips. Easy there, Remus smiled, pulling the cup away after a minute. Let's see how you do with that for now. Harry pushed himself up into a sitting position, staring around the room dazedly, as if he hadn't seen it before. How does the rest of you feel? Remus asked cautiously. Harry blinked and looked down at himself. All right, he said, but Remus didn't miss the wince when he ran a hand over his chest. Are you sure? The little boy shrugged. Remus carefully unbuttoned his pajama shirt to look at the injuries himself. He sagged with relief when he saw the fading bruises that had, only a day ago, been dark and black. The welts were receding into thin, white scars, as well, although they still looked painful. Much better, he said, smiling at Harry. Of course we'll wait until Molly gives her final opinion, but I'd say you'll be right as rain in no time. Mrs. Weasley came back around mid-morning to check on Harry. She was very pleased to find him sitting up, sipping juice, and even happier to find the bruises fading fast. You'll be up and running around and wearing Remus out in no time, she told him, dropping a kiss on the top of his head. But you gave us quite the scare last night, young man. You were awfully sick. I was. Harry asked quietly, glancing shyly up at the woman. Oh yes. We were awfully worried about you. But you're doing much better now. And why don't we try to keep it that way, home? You'll have to stay in bed until tomorrow morning, I think, but after that you can get up if you've got the energy. Mrs. Weasley stayed a little longer, talking to Harry as she redid the bandages on his arms. Harry didn't talk much. His eyes were already drooping by the time Mrs. Weasley finished. "You just get yourself some sleep, now, dear," she said gently, tucking the blankets back around him. "I'll be back to check on you tomorrow, so mind you rest up." XXXXX. Harry's fever broke for good that evening. He managed to keep down some dinner, and Remus managed to catch up on his sleep while Harry slept soundly, though he dragged a camp bed out of the closet and slept on the floor of Harry's bedroom rather than going into his own room. The next morning, Mrs. Weasley pulled off Harry's pajama shirt to reveal only pale scars left to mark his skin. It was by no means a happy sight, but both she and Remus were exceptionally glad to see it. "I can get out of bed now, right?" Harry asked timidly. "Yes, love, you most certainly can," Mrs. Weasley said, giving him a watery sort of smile. Harry spent most of the day on the couch, sleeping or looking at picture books, still lacking energy or much of an appetite. Remus sat with him, reading to him or playing games of I Spy, something Harry had never played before and was thrilled with, to pass the time. Remus was surprised how happy he was just to see the little boy smiling and looking not quite so pale. "Remus," Harry said hesitantly that afternoon. "Hm. Can I ask you something? Did you stay with me when I was sick? All night?" Harry looked embarrassed at the question, a faint pink rising in his cheeks. Of course Remus smiled. "Like Mrs. Weasley said, we were worried about you." "Did you sleep in that chair?" Harry asked quietly. "Sort of. I didn't get a lot of sleep, but neither did you." "I'm sorry," Harry whispered. "For being so much trouble." "You're no trouble at all," Remus exclaimed, though being careful to keep his voice soft. "You've nothing to apologize for, Harry. I was glad to do it. That's what adults are supposed to do when children are sick, take care of them." Harry nodded. "Thanks," he whispered, throwing a look at Remus. He shifted on the sofa as if he wanted to nestle into Remus's side or something, but stayed where he was, carefully apart from Remus, shoulders hunched and head down. "You're very welcome," Remus told him kindly, pulling Harry onto his lap. Harry watched Remus's fingers nimbly button up his bright red jacket with a blank sort of look. Remus glanced at his expression and offered a reassuring smile. "Don't worry so much. It's never as bad as you think it will be. You might even like it." Harry raised his eyes to give Remus a doubtful look. Today he started school again. And no matter what Remus said, Harry's dread was not assuaged. He wished he could just stay here in Remus's house until he was all grown up. Remus was smart. He had a lot of books. He could teach Harry everything there was to know. Remus finished the buttons and moved down to swiftly weave Harry's shoelaces into neat bows with a practiced hand. "There you are," he said, straightening up and giving Harry one more look over to see that his collar was straight and his face was cleaned. He eyed Harry's wild hair, but, remembering James's efforts with his own hair, decided not to waste any more time. "Well, that's everything, I think. Shall we get going?" Harry didn't answer, but mutely hauled his new frog backpack onto his shoulders, pulled the knit cap Mrs. Fig had sent him in low over his eyes, and shuffled to the door. Remus watched him with a mixture of amusement at how nerdy Harry managed to look, not that it mattered much in year 2, most kids looked weird that young anyway, and worry at how apprehensive he seemed to be. Harry had hardly said 2 words since dinner the previous night. Remus had tried for the last few days to get him excited about going to school, but the more he talked about it, the more anxious Harry seemed to get. He hoped it would be okay. In truth, he was leery about the whole situation. He had only had Harry for a week, but for some reason it was almost painful to send him away, even if it was just for the day. He was also nervous about what might set Harry off. Remus had no idea to what extent abuse like that had done to Harry, nor what accommodations to ask the teachers to make for him. He had spoken to a woman from the guidance office of the primary school Harry would be going to and explained the situation as best he could to her, but he couldn't tell her what sort of things Harry might be sensitive to. As the woman said, they would just have to see what happened and go from there. Remus pushed open the door and caught Harry by a mittened hand, making sure he didn't stumble on the rutted front path. Remus didn't have a car and doubted he'd be getting a license anytime soon. For one, he was not at all confident in maneuvering all of those levers and gauges that commanded those 2-ton beasts. For another, the ministry had to provide all the paperwork necessary to apply for a license, and he had not had a lot of good experiences with the ministry since Delroy's Umbridge gained power. It didn't matter though. He could apparate into town near the library where he worked, and Harry would ride the bus to school and home usually. But today Remus wanted to walk him to his classroom, meet his teacher, make sure he was alright before he left him alone for the first time. So today they walked the few miles into town. The November air was brisk and the hint of an icy edge nipped at their skin, but the weather had not yet turned to winter. The pair of them walked along in silence for a good half of the journey. Remus kept glancing down at Harry, expecting to have to carry him the rest of the way, but Harry trotted doggedly alongside him. Remus attempted to strike up conversation, asking Harry about what subjects he liked to study or if he liked art classes or music classes, trying in some way to build excitement in the little boy, but nothing he said yielded an answer more explicit than a shrug or a mumbled word or two. As they neared a point in the dirt road that met up with the paved highway, however, Harry said abruptly, "They don't like me at school." Remus looked down at him in surprise, but Harry was looking shyly at the ground, embarrassed at his admission. "Of course they will. You haven't even met them yet," Remus told him confidently. Harry shook his head. "No, they don't like me. No one did. Not even the teacher. They thought I was weird." "Harry, I'm sure that's not true." "It is," Harry interrupted, looking up at Remus with earnest eyes. "Well," Remus began again, not sure what to say to that. "Well, this is a new school with all new people. I'm sure they'll like you quite a lot once they get to know you." Harry looked dubious. "I don't think so," he said quietly. "I'm the new kid. People pick on the new kids. They don't like them just because they're new. There was a boy, Billy Waters, he came to our class last year and people said he smelled funny and that he ate a blue crayon during art time and other things like that, but he didn't. I sat next to him cause no one liked to sit next to me either, and he didn't smell funny, and I asked him about the crayon and he said he didn't eat it, but he thought Dudley might have. But everybody thought he ate the crayon, and so they wouldn't play with him or they'd make him beat it at tag and then pretend like he never caught them, even though I saw him get Linda and Michael. That's what they'll do to me." Remus was slightly astonished. Harry hadn't volunteered that much information freely, well, ever. And the worst part was Remus wasn't sure how to allay his fears because he couldn't tell Harry none of that would happen. He knew firsthand how difficult kids could be, but somehow he hadn't thought that attitude developed until they were older. "Well, kids get over it," Remus said, sounding lame even to himself. Harry didn't act as if he'd heard, and Remus couldn't blame him. "Look, that Billy Waters, was he still the new kid the last time you saw him?" Remus asked. Harry glanced questioningly at him, but shrugged. "Guess not." "Exactly. Kids get used to you and suddenly you're not new anymore, you're one of them. You'll see. I'll bet you'll have loads of friends in no time." Harry shrugged, but didn't object. He didn't bother to mention his certainty that that wouldn't happen. He hadn't been any newer than the rest of the kids at his old school, but they hadn't liked him at all there either, and that hadn't gone away. He supposed there was no Dudley here to lead the teasing and chasing, but there was surely someone just like him. And Harry knew he was still weird. He would still make magic happen, and just because he knew what it was now, didn't mean the rest of the kids wouldn't still think he was a freak. No, he couldn't see at all how this school would be so different from the last one. He stumbled a little, his muscles tired from all of the walking, and Remus, as though he'd been waiting for the cue, bent down and scooped Harry up into his arms, backpack and all, without even breaking stride. Harry tucked his head in the crook of Remus's head and closed his eyes, worrying his lip between his teeth. The jeers of his old classmates echoed in his head from just 2 weeks ago, and his stomach squirmed with nerves at facing something like that again. He didn't like being around people he didn't know. At least with people he knew, like his aunt and uncle, he knew the score. He could keep out of their way. But with people he didn't know. "It'll be all right," Remus murmured soothingly, practically feeling the anxiety emanating off the little boy through his tense muscles. It took them another 10 minutes to reach the edge of town, and Remus decided to catch a taxi for the last few blocks. He remembered why he didn't walk into town more often now. It was a long walk. Harry eyed the imposing brick school building through the cab window. It seemed to loom at him, rushing up out of the city for several blocks before the car rolled to a stop at the curb. Harry sat frozen in his seat, waiting for Remus to come around and open his door, trying to hold on to that metal and glass barrier between him and the hordes of shouting and squealing children he could already hear. But Remus barely took 5 seconds to yank open his door and unbuckle his seatbelt. And then he was pulling Harry from the car, leading him up to the gate and through the swarm. Harry pressed himself close to Remus's side, eyeing the children, most of whom seemed much bigger than him, warily. His breathing was fast and he could feel his palms sweating. The damp smell of the playground seemed sharper in his nose, the bright colors of the coats darting in and out of the crowd seemed more lurid against the dull, muddy November playground. A bell sounded shrilly as Remus led the way up the front path towards imposing double doors and Harry nearly jumped out of his skin at the sound. "It's all right," Remus told him calmingly out of the corner of his mouth, dropping Harry's hand and putting his arm around the little boy's shoulders instead. Harry looked away from the crowd of children and focused on the path in front of him. He was relieved to pass through the doors into the sudden hush of a hallway before the bell has rung to bring students bustling and clamoring into the school. "It looks nice," Remus tried to say jovially, indicating the finger paintings hanging on the walls and the bright posters about reading and math and things like that. Harry gulped, the familiar school scent making his nerves jitter. "This must be Mr. Lupin," a voice called from down the hall, making Harry jump and whip around. Remus squeezed his shoulder reassuringly and turned to meet the man walking toward them with a friendly smile. "Headmaster Jennings?" Remus asked, offering a hand. Mr. Jennings shook it vigorously, beaming at Remus. "It's fantastic to meet you. And this must be Harry." "Hello there." Mr. Jennings switched his beam to Harry, who edged a little behind Remus, looking up at the stranger with wide eyes. "Go on, Harry, it's all right." "Shake his hand," Remus urged, but Harry stayed peeking out from behind his legs. He wanted to do as he was told, but he couldn't seem to make himself move. "He's a bit shy," Remus said apologetically. "That's fine," Mr. Jennings said amiably as another bell sounded, making Harry jump again. "Here comes the rush. Better get into a classroom before the kids break down the doors." He led the way down the hall a little ways and pushed open a door with a large red 2 on it just as the first wave of students stampeded through the front doors. "Hello, Miss Arvis," Mr. Jennings called, knocking on the opened door. "I've got a new recruit for you." A woman looked up from a desk across the room. She was youngish and pretty with brown curls bouncing like springs around her face and sparkling blue eyes. She smiled at them. "Hey there. So this is the young Mr. Lupin?" she asked, peering kindly at Harry. No. This is Harry Potter," Remus corrected awkwardly. "I'm Remus Lupin, but, that's to say, he's not my son." Miss Arvis flushed a bright red, looking mortified. "Oh, I'm sorry. I just glanced at the papers and saw your name and assumed I shouldn't have. I'm awfully sorry." "It's quite all right," Remus assured her, feeling heat rise in his own face. He supposed he'd have to be explaining that a lot if Harry got to stay with him for any amount of time, and it had reminded him with a pang of Lily and James when he'd said "not my son." "Right, well, my name is Miss Arvis," Miss Arvis continued, still blushing. "I'm glad to have you in my class, Harry. I'm sure we'll get along just splendidly." Harry looked timidly up at her. "Well, I'll let Miss Arvis take it from here," Mr. Jennings said, rocking on the balls of his feet. "There are just a few more papers to sign, Mr. Lupin, if you want to come down to my office before you leave. Last door on the right. I hope you have an excellent first day, Harry," he added, giving one last genial smile before disappearing, dodging past a group of excited young girls darting into the classroom. "Now then, here's where you'll be sitting, Harry," Miss Arvis said, leading them over to a desk in the second row beside the window where a large sticker in the shape of a pencil read "Harry" in capital letters. "You'll keep your coat and your bag in a cubby back here." She walked to the back of the room and indicated an open cubby in the corner with a matching name tag proclaiming that it was now Harry's. "Every morning you'll play outside until the first bell rings. That bell means you're to get into a line with the other children in your class. When the second bell rings you're to come into the building in an orderly line, find your cubby, and place your things in it. Then you'll find your seat, and when the last bell rings, we'll start class." Harry nodded, uncomfortably aware of the other students, who had all filed into the classroom by now, watching him with curiosity, some whispering behind their hands already. He noticed a blond boy snicker something to his friend and was sure it was the beginning of the crayon rumors. Rumus helped Harry take off his coat and hang it up with his backpack in the cubby as Miss Arvis explained where everything was in the classroom and the rules associated with each item. "Children, please get out your workbooks," Miss Arvis ordered, noticing all the eyes on Harry and Rumus. The children reluctantly turned away from the strangers and began shuffling through their things, chatter breaking out as usual. Rumus bent down in front of Harry and put his hands on Harry's shoulders. "Well, I've got to get going. I know Miss Arvis won't have any trouble from you." "It'll be fine," Rumus assured him again when Harry nodded without looking at him. "You'll see. You'll like it." Harry shrugged, then suddenly looked up at Rumus, his eyes a little wild. He threw a nervous glance over his shoulder at Miss Arvis and leaned in to whisper, "You'll come get me, won't you? At the end of school you'll come and get me, right? I don't have to walk all the way back to your house, do I? I don't know the way. I'll get lost." "Of course I'll be here to get you when school's over," Rumus soothed, running a hand through Harry's messy hair. "You won't ever have to walk home by yourself. I'll be waiting right outside to pick you up when the last bell rings, how about that? Promise?" Harry whispered. "Promise," Rumus said solemnly. Harry relaxed a little. "Okay. You won't leave me here?" "Absolutely not." Rumus drew back, reluctant to leave, but Miss Arvis was hovering behind Harry and the rest of the children kept sneaking glances at them over their shoulders. "I'll be here to pick you up. And if you have any trouble, you call me at the library. Miss Arvis has the number, she can dial it for you, all right?" Harry nodded. "Good. Now I'll see you this afternoon." "Have a good time." Rumus hesitated. The protocol would be to hug the little boy, but Harry already stood rigid and jumpy, so Rumus squeezed his shoulder one last time and stood up. "Goodbye, Miss Arvis. It was nice meeting you." And Rumus forced himself to turn and walk out of the room past the whispering students, feeling quite as nervous as Harry. "Where'd you come from? How come your dad came into school with you? What's wrong with your head?" The questions came the moment Miss Arvis let them outside for recess. Harry suddenly found himself at the center of a small knot of kids clustering around him curiously. He felt heat rushing up in his face and tried to shuffle back a few steps, but the group just pressed in closer, jumping at anything new in their routine environment. "I what not my," Harry stammered, struggling wildly to find answers and force them out of his mouth. He was finding it hard to breathe under the avid stares of his classmates and was hugely relieved when Miss Arvis came over to see what was going on. "Come on, don't squish Harry now," she said, chivying the children along. "Go on and play. Why don't you show Harry how you play football? And Stephen, it's rude to ask questions like that." The little group scattered at once. The blond boy Harry had seen whispering to his friend earlier and who had asked what was wrong with his head, staring at the scar slashed across Harry's forehead, shot a smirk at him over his shoulder as he raced off with his friends. Harry didn't follow them. He backed up a few steps to press himself against the school building and watched the rest of the children running around warily. Miss Arvis noticed. "Don't you want to go play, Harry?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He jumped a little bit and looked up at her, but said nothing. In fact, she had not heard him say anything all morning. Not since he'd whispered something to the man who'd brought him in. Miss Arvis was still trying to figure out exactly what relationship that man had to Harry. "So, how has your first morning been here at Whitefield Primary School?" Miss Arvis asked, attempting again to coax some words out of the little boy. Harry shrugged one shoulder, still looking up at her warily. "That good, eh?" she asked, smiling slightly. "Well, I'm sure you'll settle in quite nicely." "What sort of?" But her next question was cut off by a cry of Miss Arvis. A girl Harry recognized from the seat in front of him came running up to them. She had a lot of bushy brown hair, rather large front teeth, and at the moment was streaked with dirt. "Miss Arvis, Stephen stomped on my worms," she exclaimed, looking quite indignant. "Your woes?" Miss Arvis asked, raising an eyebrow. "What on earth were you doing with worms, Hermione?" "My science project," Hermione explained impatiently. My dad says there's all kinds of worms and he got me a book that tells all about them and I'm going to make a poster all about them, but Stephen stomped on the ones I found today and now I can't draw them. He ought to go to the wall. He did it on purpose. Did not. Stephen, who was sulking a few feet away, protested. He came forward a few steps. I didn't see them. Hermione's a tattletale. I am not, I told you they were there. Hermione said snippily. I didn't see them. Stephen insisted. Enough of this, Miss Arvis cut in. Stephen, whether you saw Hermione's worms or not, you need to apologize. Stephen muttered a quick sorry before dashing off to rejoin his friends. Hermione looked unsatisfied. He did it on purpose. Hermione repeated, looking up at Miss Arvis indignantly. He should be in trouble. I'll talk to him, Miss Arvis assured Hermione. Hey, I've got an idea. Harry, why don't you help Hermione with her project? Don't you think that might be fun? He doesn't know anything about worms, Hermione said at once. He wouldn't know what to do. Besides, I don't want help. I like doing posters alone. Hermione, Miss Arvis said with a hint of warning. Haven't we talked about working with others? Harry's new here and he doesn't know anybody. You ought to include him. Harry didn't think drawing worms sounded like very much fun, especially since it was recess. Why was this girl working on schoolwork during recess? But he could tell, just like Hermione, that neither one of them had much of a choice in the matter. Hermione looked at him appraisingly. All right, but he better do it just as I tell him. Hermione, Miss Arvis said again. We've talked about being bossy, too. Yes, Miss Arvis, Hermione said, looking a bit embarrassed. Then she turned to Harry. Come on, I'll show you my station. She seized his wrist and dragged him away across the playground. That's Stephen Morris. Hermione huffed as she marched towards the fence on the other side of the playground. He did it on purpose. He always does. Yesterday he kicked a ball right across my papers and got mud all over them, and last week he stole my razor and wouldn't give it back, and when I told Miss Arvis, he said it was his and she believed him because he wrote his name on it in marker. Hermione raged away, not seeming to care if Harry was listening or not. She talked rather quickly and didn't need to seem to breath quite as much as normal people. Here it is, she said, stomping abruptly at a patch of mud near the fence. This is my station. Those are my drawings and that's my book and those are my pencils. You can help me dig up more worms since Stephen stomped on the other ones. Harry quickly found out two things about Hermione as he helped her dig through the mud for worms. First, she was very bossy, and second, she didn't need to rely on a second person to keep up a conversation. The first thing he didn't like so much because it meant she was always correcting what he was doing and making him do things over. But the second thing he didn't mind at all because it meant he didn't have to think of things to say or answer questions. By the time Miss Arvis called them all in, Harry had found 3 new worms for Hermione to draw and both of them were smeared with dirt. Harry hadn't realized how messy he'd gotten until Miss Arvis sent the 2 of them to wash their hands and he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. And almost at once, Aunt Petunia's voice, shrill and irritated, screeched in his head, "You aren't coming into this house looking like that, boy. We give you clothes and you go and ruin them playing in the mud. Honestly, you could be a little more grateful for what we've done for you. Vernon, get the hose." Someone poked him in the back and Harry jumped so badly he nearly smashed face first into the sink at the back of the classroom. "Class is going to be starting, hurry up." Hermione hissed and Harry nearly flew out of the way so that she could use the sink, whipping his still soapy hands on his muddy jeans. Hermione stared at him. "You're supposed to use the towels," she said, handing him a paper towel from the dispenser. "What's the matter with you, anyway? You look odd." Harry turned and hurried back to his desk, sinking as low in the chair as he could and avoiding everyone's eyes. He wondered how angry Remus would be with him for getting his clothes all dirty. Probably not as mad as Aunt Petunia, he tried to assure himself, but the idea of making Remus angry at all was enough to make him feel slightly sick. Harry was glad when it was time for lunch. He had tried to pay attention, but between worrying about getting his clothes muddy and the way Stephen Morris, who sat next to Hermione, kept whispering to his friends during work time and looking over at Harry, he had found it hard to concentrate. He stood on tiptoe to reach the zipper on his backpack and pull out the lunch bag Rumus had packed for him that morning, and then turned to see what the rest of the class was doing. Miss Avis was chivying them into a line at the door, so Harry joined the back behind a girl with red braids. The girl looked at Harry and then at his paper bag lunch and scrunched up her face. She turned hastily to her friend. "Switch spots with me, Gwen, I don't want to be near it," she begged. Her friend looked around curiously, saw Harry, and shook her head. "Neither do I. What if they start crawling out?" Gwen gave a little shriek and pushed at her friend, trying to get as far away from Harry as she could. Harry stood there, turning red and wanting to ask what they were talking about, but unable to open his mouth. "I'll switch with you," a boy halfway up the line called back. "I don't mind em." He was a little fat with a lot of orange freckles all over his face, a big nose, and bushy eyebrows, and he wore a shirt with a green alien on it. He waddled down to where the red-haired girl was and she scuttled away, throwing one last nervous glance at the lunch bag in Harry's hand. The boy had already started his lunch waiting in line. He stood munching loudly on a carrot and staring interestedly at Harry. "Can I see em?" he asked after a few seconds of Harry fidgeting uncomfortably. See what?" Harry asked nervously. "The worms," the boy said eagerly. "I heard you eat worms for lunch, that's why you were helping Hermione at recess." "I heard you ate one for a snack." "No!" Harry exclaimed, disgusted and panicked. I don't have worms in my bag." He opened the bag and the boy leaned over to look for himself. He looked disappointed. "Or, Stephen was lying," he said to Gwen. "Was not." Stephen said form behind Harry, making him jump. "He mashes em up and puts em in his sandwich, I bet. Bet he drinks bug juice, too." "You." Gwen squealed, but the boy looked excited again. "I don't." Harry protested, turning around to look at Stephen. "Stop telling them that," he begged, but Stephen was leering. "I saw you eat one," he grinned. "Didn't you, Lionel?" he asked, turning to one of his friends. The boy nodded, grinning stupidly. Harry opened his mouth to protest again, but Miss Avis was calling for quiet and the line was starting to move. No one seemed to want to sit by Harry in the lunchroom. He could tell just from the disgusted looks most of the class was giving him and his lunch that they had all heard what Stephen was saying about him and believed it. Hermione was the only one who didn't seem to care, but maybe that was because she was too engrossed in her diagrams. Harry thought about trying to sit next to her, but decided he didn't want to spend his lunch getting his ear talked off about her science project. Also, she seemed like she might not want the company, the way her drawings were spread around the table, and he wasn't sure if he liked or not yet. And he didn't need to perpetuate the worm rumors anymore. So instead, Harry found an empty place away from the rest of his class. In a way, he was almost glad. He was used to eating by himself, after all. It was easier. At recess that afternoon, Harry didn't help Hermione with her project. Stephen and his friends had been laughing and looking over at him the way Dudley and his gang used to before they started chasing him, and from long experience, Harry knew it would be best just to stay out of their way. He found a place under the slide that was relatively sheltered, but where he could still see Miss Avis so he'd know when it was time to come in. He didn't stay near her in case she tried to make him play with Hermione again. Harry spent the time outside trying to brush the dirt off his clothes, but it had already sunk into the fabric in muddy streaks. This only made him feel worse. Harry didn't want to meet Remus outside of the school when the last bell rang and the rest of the class swarmed out the door to the buses. When Remus had left him this morning, he thought this time couldn't come quickly enough, but it was with trepidation that Harry dragged his muddy jacket on and pulled his frog backpack over his shoulders. He knew school wouldn't be any good at all. Everybody thought he ate worms, and on top of that, he'd be in trouble when Remus saw him. Harry jumped. He hadn't realized Miss Avis was standing a few feet behind him. "Would you like me to walk you out to meet, Remus?" she asked. Harry hesitated, then nodded, pulling his knit cap low over his eyes. Remus might not be mad right away if Miss Avis was with him. She offered her hand and Harry took it, letting her lead him out of the classroom and towards the front doors. "So, how was your first day?" Miss Avis asked cheerily. Harry didn't answer, too nervous and miserable to try to think of a response. "How come you sat by yourself at lunch?" she asked, determined to get at least one word out of him today. Harry just shrugged. "I thought maybe you would sit with Hermione. You two seemed to get along." Harry shrugged again. Then Miss Arvis pushed the doors open and Harry saw Remus sitting on the steps. He turned at the sound of the doors and Harry froze. The logical part of him was telling him he shouldn't be scared, that Remus was not anything like his aunt and uncle, that he wouldn't shout and not let him in the house, but the rest of him was too busy remembering the Dursleys to listen to logic. "Hello," Remus said, smiling at both of them. "How'd it go?" Harry stood between Miss Arvis and Remus, staring down at his shoes and not saying a thing. Remus looked uncertainly at Miss Arvis. "That's what I've been asking him all day, but he hasn't told me a thing." "First days are always hard," she added sympathetically. "It'll get easier. He'll loosen up." "Certainly," Remus said, looking worriedly down at the silent child before him. "Should we head home then, Harry?" Harry's answer was to take a few halting steps over to Remus, still looking fixedly at the ground. This did not ease Remus's anxiety. It had taken him the entire week he'd had Harry to get him to relax completely, or almost completely. Would that all be undone in just one day? He wondered what had happened. Nothing Miss Arvis seemed to know about. Remus hesitated, but bent down and lifted Harry into his arms. Harry stayed tense, stiffening in Remus's grip. "Thanks for walking him out to me," Remus said to Harry's teacher. "He'll be on the bus tomorrow." "Goodbye, Miss Arvis." Remus carried Harry all the way home. He could have gotten a taxi, but he didn't. It was a stupid reason, really, but it felt too much like last Saturday, when he'd first brought Harry home, and Remus was afraid that all the headway they'd made in the week since then would be erased. And the longer Harry stayed stiff and silent, the more he worried. Maybe it had been too soon to start school. Maybe he should have kept Harry home with him longer, made sure he really was okay before he sent him off to school. It wasn't until they were home and he was unbuttoning Harry's coat that Remus noticed the mud. "How did you get so dirty?" he asked lightly as he hung Harry's coat up. Harry didn't answer. He peeked shyly up at Remus, biting his lip. An alarming idea struck Remus and he knelt in front of Harry once more to look more closely at him, looking for scratches or scrapes he might have missed, pulling up Harry's sleeves and running a hand through Harry's hair. "Did you fall during recess?" he asked, trying not to sound as anxious as he was. Harry shook his head and Remus's stomach plummeted. "Did someone push you?" he asked. "Did you get picked on?" Harry shook his head again, and Remus stopped looking for injuries, relieved. "Then how'd you get all covered in mud?" "Digging for worms," Harry mumbled. Remus blinked, then a grin broke out across his face. That was the most normal thing Harry had done since he'd been with Remus. He started to laugh and Harry looked up sharply, not sure if this was a good sign or not. "I was helping a girl with her science project," Harry explained in a mumbled. "That's excellent." Remus beamed. "See? I told you you'd make friends." But Harry shook his head miserably. "Miss Arvis made me and she wanted to draw worms more than she wanted to talk to me," Harry explained. He had decided that Remus was not mad about the mud and felt rather stupid for being so scared. His logic was saying "I told you so" very smugly to the rest of him. And suddenly his bottom lip began to tremble and he flung his arms around Remus's neck, burying his face in Remus's shoulder. He wasn't sure what possessed him to do it, but he couldn't get the way nearly everyone in his class had looked at all day out of his head. And suddenly he found himself telling Remus everything. All about the worms and Stephen Morris and how Gwen and her friend didn't want to be next to him in line. He wasn't sure how much Remus had understood because he'd kept his face buried in Remus's shoulder, but Remus rubbed soothing circles into his back and listened until Harry had talked himself out. When Harry had fallen quiet again except for ragged breathing as he tried not bawl like a toddler, Remus resettled him on his lap and looked down at him. "Rough day then, eh?" he asked softly. Harry nodded. Remus sighed. "I know it must be getting old, but it will get better, I promise. If that Stephen boy gives you a hard time, you should tell Miss Arvis though, all right?" "I don't want to be a snitch," Harry mumbled. "If he keeps picking on you, you aren't snitching," Remus told him. "Come on, I've got the perfect cure for long hard days. He set Harry on his feet and led the way into the kitchen, opened the freezer, and pulled out a carton of chocolate ice cream. "What do you think?" he asked, setting it down on the counter and lifting Harry up beside it. "Before dinner and everything. Sound good?" Harry nodded, and for the first time all day, a little smile broke out on his face.